Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Global Connections Television, a privately funded, independently produced program, is provided as a public service to help us better understand international issues. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with any type of a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just like our programs, you have a website and you want to share them, please feel free to do so. Again, Global Connections Television is provided free of charge to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're going to be taking a look at a very unique product in a very unique state in the United States, and that is bourbon. And my guest is an expert on this particular topic. Gregory, president of the Kentucky Distillers Association, is a veteran communicator with more than 25 years of experience in governmental affairs, marketing journalism, and strategic public relations. Gregory, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you very much, Bill, for having me.
I appreciate you being with me.
Sure, thank you.
Okay, you got a great voice. You should be on radio at least, TV too.
I was a reporter at one point in my life, but nothing to do with voice.
That's right, very true. Well, let's talk about the Kentucky Distillers Association. When was it formed? Why was it formed? What's your mission?
Yeah, sure. Well, it was formed back in 1880 when 32 distillers got together in Louisville and decided they were tired of paying federal taxes. So they wanted somebody, an organization, to advocate on their behalf. So we're 139 years old. Now, we did go dark during Prohibition, like everybody else did, but our mission is to promote, protect, and elevate Kentucky's signature bourbon and distilled spirits industry. We have headquarters in Frankfort, the capital city, and we also have offices in Louisville and Bardstown, the bourbon capital of the world.
Mm-hmm. And you led right into my next question. Kentucky is often called the bourbon capital of the world. Why is that?
Well, several reasons. First of all, we like to say wood, water, and grain. So we have a great water source here in Kentucky. We sit on a limestone shelf, and that limestone shelf acts as a natural filter to take out all the iron and other minerals that would really mess up the taste of Kentucky bourbon. We have 4 distinct seasons here in Kentucky. If you've ever been to Kentucky, you know the old adage is wait 10 minutes and the weather will change. But we have very hot summers and very cold winters. And that temperature change allows the whiskey to breathe into the wood of the barrel and extract all those natural sugars and vanillas that give it its amber color and smooth taste. We have plenty of Kentucky corn here. In fact, Kentucky was founded when we were part of Virginia back in the 1700s. Mm-hmm. If you settled in Kentucky, you got what was called a corn writ. So as long as you farmed here and cleared the land and grew corn, you could have permanent access to the land. And so we had a lot of farmers develop corn. And then, when the farmers moved down from Pennsylvania and other places to settle the Kentucky frontier after the Revolutionary War, they realized all these things. They realized that we had the perfect water, the perfect weather, and all the conditions that are right for making the world's best whiskey. So they stayed here, thankfully, and now we produce 95% of all the world's bourbon.
Mm-hmm. And now Kentucky is basically a smaller, it's not the smallest state in the United States of the 50 states, but it's a smaller state. It's about 80,000 square kilometers, 42,000 square miles, has about 4.4 million inhabitants, that type of thing. But as you mentioned, it has a diversity of seasons and a lot of diversity of topographical landscaping, to be quite honest.
True.
So that all plays into it.
It does, and you'll see a lot of the distilleries kind of cloister around the Lexington, Louisville, Bardstown area, and that's where a lot of them settled, mainly because it was easy to get their product to the rivers to transport back then. Because if you think about 200 years ago in Kentucky, probably not very good many roads. Not very many roads or not very good roads.
Both.
And mountainous for sure around this area. So the farmers had all this excess corn and didn't know what to do with it. Well, they can convert it to whiskey and use it as a commodity, and that's what they did. They would put it in barrels and take it to Louisville, a major port, or a little city called Limestone Landing, which is now known as Maysville up in northern Kentucky, and put their barrels on probably flatboats or steamships down the Ohio River to go to the Mississippi and then be enjoyed all throughout the South.
Mm-hmm. Now, what are the ingredients that go into bourbon? I know bourbon is sold worldwide. It's a very popular drink.
We're very much part of the global economy right now.
Very, very true, yes. What are the ingredients that go into it?
Well, it must be made by federal statute with at least 51% corn, and that's what really makes it different from a lot of the other world whiskeys. Anything after that can be a primary grain, such as wheat, rye, and usually malted barley to make up the difference. Another difference in Kentucky bourbon versus anything else is it can only be aged in a brand new charred oak barrel. So that barrel can never be reused again. In fact, we send a lot of our barrels overseas for the Scotch and other whiskeys that can use their whiskeys in a charred oak barrel. And so we feel like we're a little part of the whole global whiskey market because they're using our products as well. It must be aged at least 2 years to be called straight bourbon. And if it's aged less than 4 years, the age must be on the bottle. So if you see a bottle that doesn't have an age statement on it, it usually means it's older than 4 years these days. But most of our premium Kentucky bourbons are aged somewhere between 6 and 12 years old. And there are other standards like you can't have it for sale less than 80 proof. You can't put it in the barrel, it's so large a proof and things like that. But the primary differences are 51% corn at least and aged in a brand new charred oak barrel.
Now, in Kentucky, how many distilleries do you have? As I recall, Kentucky produces 95% of all the bourbon in the world.
We do.
But we're not the only state producing bourbon. But
we're not.
How many distilleries do you have in this state and then versus around the United States and maybe even overseas?
Sure. Well, we have 40 distilling companies operating 68 distilleries in Kentucky. So some distilleries have more than one. Some companies have more than one distillery, obviously. Now, all 50 states are distilling right now. There's been a great distilled spirits movement over the last 6 or 7 years, especially with the craft distilling movement. In fact, we saw them come to Kentucky in about 2010 and 2011. But nationwide, there's over 1,800 distilleries. So we do face some competition here in Kentucky, which is why we're really upping our game to make sure that Kentucky remains the one true and authentic home for bourbon.
Now, are there distilleries overseas or not?
Oh, of course, not bourbon distilleries,
Not
obviously.
bourbon. Okay.
But Scotch has been producing whiskey for centuries. They've probably got about a 600-year head start on us here in Kentucky. We're kind of the new kids on the block, when it comes to whiskey. Japanese whiskey is an old industry, and in fact, they even own a couple of our distilleries here in Kentucky right now. Canadian whiskey, Irish whiskey is really picking up right now and booming. So we're all part of one big global whiskey market, and a lot of our Kentucky distilleries even have, like you said, distilleries overseas. So they'll produce a bourbon in Kentucky and a Scotch whiskey and an Irish whiskey and a Japanese whiskey and a Canadian whiskey, and really expand their portfolio.
Is Jameson still the predominant Irish whiskey, or are there competitors now?
Jameson, Johnny Walker, yeah.
Oh, Johnny Walker,
Irish whiskey distillery.
Irish,
that's Scotch. Jameson, yes, I would say so predominantly. But there's a lot of newcomers to the Irish whiskey scene. They, in fact, came over to Kentucky a few years ago and said, how do we do one of these whiskey trails like you have over here? So we've been helping them create an Irish whiskey trail there. And again, it's amazing. The one thing that I guess was a little bit of a pleasant surprise for me when I took this job was how close-knit the global whiskey family is. It's an industry that's really built on collaboration and camaraderie. Yes, they're competitors on the shelf, but they're all friends and they know each other. When you see each other, even here in Kentucky, you give each other a big hug and how's the business going over there and everything. So it's one great big family.
You mentioned the Bourbon Trail. What is the Kentucky Bourbon Trail?
Well, in 1999, we only produced 455,000 barrels as a state that year. It was one of the low points in all of Kentucky bourbon, as people had switched their allegiances from brown spirits to clear spirits like vodka, gin, and rum. So our distilleries got together to think, what can we do to create more brand ambassadors and awareness for Kentucky bourbon? They saw what was happening in California with wine country, which was really growing fast and is a great tourism benefit for that area. And overseas, Scotch whiskey had just started a Scotch whiskey trail. So we have all these distilleries within an hour's drive of each other. We said, why don't we create a Kentucky bourbon trail? And I think they'll be the first to tell you they didn't know what they had, and now it is a major tourism driver for the state of Kentucky. We get over 1.4 million stops a year on average, and visitors are coming from all 50 states and more than 50 countries.
That's quite a boost for tourism.
It really is, and it's really helped to change the Kentucky tourists overnight. It's a very affluent demographic. It's a younger demographic than your typical tourists, and they're staying longer and they're coming in packs. So you see Louisville, Bardstown, Frankfort, Kentucky, a lot of the communities with distilleries are really creating more and more tourism experiences here to build upon the Kentucky Bourbon Trail.
Now, any type of industry is going to be good for an area. It's going to help create jobs. What is the impact of bourbon on, let's say, job production or job creation in the state of Kentucky, and maybe even outside the state?
Well, it's growing, that's for sure. In the past 10 years, we've doubled the number of jobs that the distilled spirits industry in Kentucky generates. And I have to say distilled spirits because we have brandy distilleries and moonshine distilleries here as well. It's not just all bourbon. But we're responsible for about 20,100 jobs here in Kentucky right now, carrying $1 billion in payroll. That's up significantly over the last 10 years. We generate about $235 million in local state taxes, and we're right in the middle of a $2.3 billion capital investment campaign where the distilleries are building everything from new production centers and warehouses to tasting rooms and tourism places, even music venues at the distilleries. So it's a growing industry and it's really thriving, and it's really helped Kentucky kind of weather some of the recession years.
Mm-hmm. That is, when you think bourbon, you're going to be thinking Kentucky. That's for sure.
Yes.
There's no doubt about it. And the capital investment campaign, are the distilleries, they're all putting their own money in, they're borrowing money to do this? How do they do
It depends on the distillery. Some of them I know will only invest if they got the money in the bank. Some of them obviously do borrow a distillery, so we're good for the banking industry as well in Kentucky. But you think about that, $2.3 billion over 10 years is a pretty significant investment. And that's why our jobs are going up. And we actually have the second highest spin-off factor in the state of Kentucky behind light trucks and utility vehicles. So we have Ford and Corvette here and things like that. So for every job in the bourbon industry that's created, 3 more are created down the line. So everything from obviously corn and farming, agriculture, to trucking, hospitality, glassware, corks, you name it, everything that Kentucky bourbon needs, copper. We have a great copper industry here down to produce stills. The cooperages that produce all the barrels, they're all right here in Kentucky. So it's really an economic driver for the Commonwealth.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned back in the 90s that the sales were not as good as they are today, obviously.
70s, 80s, and early 90s.
70s, 80s, and 90s,
yes.
right, there we go.
We took a nosedive.
I was just curious, what do you attribute the change in taste to people in the United States and around the world? Because bourbon's very popular overseas,
oh,
in
yes.
a large number of countries, which we'll get to in a minute. But what's contributing to this?
Well, there are several things really that's driving it. First of all is the rise of the premium small batch and single barrel bourbons. So in the 1980s, you had distilleries like come up with products like Blanton's, or Jim Beam had Knob Creek, or Basil Hayden, Booker, small batch and single barrels. And those are exactly what you expect. A single barrel is a honey barrel. So the master distiller comes and picks up what they think is the best barrel. Or a small batch is a blending of 2 or 3 barrels or 40 or 50 barrels, just depending on where they're in the warehouse. So that has, really increased the quality of Kentucky bourbon to where now we're on par with some of the great whiskeys from around the world. Secondly, the mixologists, we didn't call them that, we call them bartenders.
Bartenders.
They realized that Kentucky bourbon was fantastic in a cocktail, this new premium drink. And so now we've had what we call the Mad Men effect. People see Don Draper and Mad Men ordering an old fashioned and they won't go to the bar. Well, I want to order an old fashioned too. Mm-hmm. So all the classic cocktails are back. The Sadkar, the Julep, as we're in Derby season here in Kentucky, the Manhattan. These are all classic bourbon cocktails, and they're being served in all the great bars and bourbon bars, whiskey bars all across the country. We've also got the opening of free trade agreements globally. So in the 1990s, you had to sign free trade agreements with the EU and NAFTA with Canada and Mexico, and that for the first time in generations put us on a level playing field with Scotch and other whiskeys, where it reduced our taxes to 0 tariffs, and we were able to compete better. And then finally, I think you've got the bourbon tourism experience has really helped generate the bourbon boom. The millennials especially, they like authenticity. They want to know the history and heritage behind everything they eat and drink. And in Kentucky, you can come to our distilleries on the Kentucky Bourbon Trail Tour and dip your hand in the mash and taste it. You can go in the warehouses and smell the angel share, as it's evaporating from the barrel. So it's a very authentic experience. So all these things together kind of created a perfect storm for Kentucky bourbon to where we're literally just beginning the golden age here in Kentucky.
Mm-hmm. The United States recently has gotten into applying tariffs
yes.
to aluminum, steel, that type of thing, those types of items. The European Union has reacted. They've put tariffs on bourbon, for example,
mm-hmm.
Or distilled spirits, I should say.
Right.
How has that impacted the industry? What does the long-range forecast appear to be with this situation?
That's a great question, because we had all hoped that this was a short-term issue, that the administration was using this as leverage to try to get a quick trade resolution with a lot of other things like steel and aluminum, as you mentioned. Unfortunately, it's dragged out longer than anyone expected. So last year, most of our bigger distilleries that had the global connections and the global distribution network were able to stockpile their products overseas before the tariffs took effect in July. Nowadays, we're 8-10 months after that now, those are starting to wane. So we've got companies now starting to see the effects. Brown-Forman announced recently that if their tariffs remain, that they're looking at least $125 million hit in their earnings this year. So we're doing everything we can to try to convince the administration and other global leaders to sit down at the table over a glass of whiskey. We don't care if it's Scotch or Kentucky bourbon or Canadian or what, and resolve these tariffs, because a tariff is a tax, and it's a 25% tax on our products overseas, which is putting us at a competitive disadvantage.
A tariff is a tax, and the consumer pays the tax.
The consumer pays it, or the distillery in some cases has tried to absorb as much of that as possible. It all depends on your business model. Some of them have and some of them haven't. But if you do, that's still less profits coming back home to Kentucky, which means less investment and fewer jobs created. So we really don't like any of their options. Passing it along, you're risking competitiveness on the shelf, and absorbing it, you're looking at less investment coming back here to Kentucky. So we continue to be cautiously optimistic, but we hope it can be worked out soon.
While we're talking international, what are some of your best export markets? Where do you find your shipping, or not you, but the companies are shipping the large parts of their bourbon supply?
Well, we export about $500 million worth of Kentucky bourbon every year, and the EU makes up almost 50% of that at over $200 million. So the EU market is a total is our biggest export market. But also Australia is a huge market for us. Canada, Mexico are huge markets for us. And then we have emerging markets that we're just now starting to scratch the surface. Russia, China, obviously, Korea, Vietnam. We're trying to get our tariffs situation straightened out there so we can really expand those markets. China is another one that's put a 25% tariff on American whiskey. And if we don't get that resolved too, that's really going to hurt that emerging market.
It certainly will. There's no doubt about it. Yes. Well, this is such a critical industry, and it's one that is so important to people in Kentucky and people around the world too, especially if you like bourbon.
Yes.
It's extremely, extremely important. What do you see as you look over the horizon as far as what the future is going to be for bourbon? Do you think this trend will continue, or do you see bumps in the road other than the tariffs?
The tariffs, that's obviously a big issue for us, because that could have long-term consequences and hurt our production and sales over the long run. Here at home in Kentucky, we're the highest tax industry in the state. Over 30 cents on every dollar goes to taxes, and 60% of every bottle. So there's 7 different taxes here in Kentucky before our whiskey ever reaches your lips. We're trying to do something about that with the legislature, because that's harming us from bringing in craft distillers, the next generation of distilleries. A lot of other states have lower taxes on distilled spirits or alcohol in general, and you see more and more distilleries going there just from a business standpoint. So we're trying to reduce our tax burden here in Kentucky. Shipping is another big issue for us right now. Wine can be shipped in over 46 states, and the wine industry has done a fantastic job in the last 40 years to really help get states to be reciprocal with each other, so you can ship from state to state. That's not the same for spirits. You can only do that in 12 states right now. But as everybody's ordering everything online these days, we'd like to open up more states to shipping and trade. So we think that's a big issue.
Now, we've been talking about bourbon, but one statement I think we can make about bourbon and every other distilled liquid out there is we want people to drink responsibly.
Yes.
We do not want people to run out and get drunk or have car wrecks or anything like that.
That's right.
What are you doing to help promote that message, to get it out to people that it's fine to enjoy a shot of bourbon or whatever, but how do you do it and do it responsibly?
Well, that's a great question. Everything in moderation, obviously.
Right.
But at the KDA, we actually hired our first full-time director of social responsibility, because you're right, we are promoting the bourbon industry 24/7, and there is a delicate balance with that, because we want people to enjoy Kentucky bourbon and distilled spirits. We want them to do it in the right way. So we promote things like a Safe Rides Home campaign. We've got a great partner in Lyft, and they've been helping us on major holidays like St. Patrick's Day, you think of as a pretty big consumption day, to get people to plan ahead and choose a safe ride, either by a designated driver or a service like Lyft. We have created public service announcements to teach people when they come to Kentucky how to drink like a true Kentuckian responsibly. Plan ahead, use one of our great transportation partners like Mint Julep Tours or R&R Limo to really let somebody else do the driving for you as you visit distilleries. And then we've got hydration stations at events. and the distilleries have embraced the mocktail culture. So there's a
Mocktail?
mocktails. Yes.
What is that?
Well, so you can create a cocktail with or without bourbon, and really, that's a huge movement across the country right now. And you see not only at our distilleries, but fine bars and restaurants offering mocktails on their menu. Because you may have pregnant mothers who are looking to still go out and socially have a good time.
Who should not be drinking.
No, who should not be drinking. Or your designated driver wants to have fun, but obviously not have alcohol. So there are some fantastic mocktails being developed that taste almost like the real thing. And you go to our website at kybourbon.com and we'll have plenty of those recipes for you.
This must pose a unique challenge for the mixologists, the people we used to call bartenders.
Yes.
They have to learn all these, excuse me, these new drinks, figure out what to do with the bourbon, without the bourbon, just on across the board. So it's quite a challenge.
It really is, and that's why they're called mixologists now, I think, rather than bartenders, because, I mean, you've got classes now on how to, create all these different cocktails, plus they're all experimenting. And, even in Kentucky and at other great bars all over the world, we really have been fascinated with how these really experts, who know the whiskey almost as good as our distillers do, and how they're very versatile and sophisticated, and matching them with different flavors and things. I mean, there are now bacon-infused cocktails.
Oh, really?
So, it's a great time. That's another thing that's really, I think, surprised us, the culinary aspect of Kentucky bourbon. The best restaurants in Kentucky now are creating bourbon-inspired dinners. Weed & Michael, Chef Edward Lee in Louisville, are just selling out with these, pairing bourbons and great food together. It's really helped, again, from the tourism side with Kentucky.
It certainly has, no doubt about that. Do you have a breakdown of the demographics? We were talking about older people, younger people, older people. Do you have an idea of folks, 50 and above, or folks who are between 30 and 49 or something like that, plus the millennials who are coming online, as to their preferences? Yeah,
well, it's obviously skewing younger. Again, I think with the millennials, the authenticity and the history and heritage is a big driver. But your typical bourbon drinker is between 23 and 54 years old. They usually drink spirits monthly. They come to Kentucky Bourbon Trail in packs of anywhere 3 to 5 people, so they're coming in groups to really enjoy it. And they're a more affluent demographic. Almost half of them have a monthly household income of over $100,000. So people today, they're really trading up when it comes to consuming alcohol. They're searching out for these premium brands, and the vintage whiskey market has become bigger. There's vintage whiskey bars all over the country, and especially here in Kentucky, where
these are the old bottles
of
whiskey
that
the
you're
dusties,
finding, as we call them,
finding in the attics, or
right?
What?
Bartenders and club owners are going out and searching for those, and if your law permits it, like it does here in Kentucky, you can serve those to the consumer. So you can go in and sample a pre-prohibition bottle of Kentucky bourbon or rye. That was a big, cocktail mixer, rye whiskey back before Prohibition, and or just some of the great brands we've had recently that were on such short supply, such limited allocations that they were sold out quickly. But the whiskey bars are buying them back, and now you can taste them.
Mm-hmm. Well, that sounds like a great deal.
It is. It's a lot of fun. It really is.
You got a fun job.
I do.
You really do.
I am blessed.
Yeah,
I'm extremely lucky to be in this position.
Very
I'm a
good.
born and raised Kentuckian, and this is to me the epitome of my career.
Exactly. What do you see? Do you have any plans for future developments? What would you like to do as far as raising the visibility of bourbon and to help people do it responsibly?
Well, one of the things that we're working on right now at KDA is a marketing campaign to make sure that the word Kentucky is synonymous with the word bourbon. Since we do have distillation in all 50 states right now, that competition is only going to grow. And Kentucky produces 95% of the world's bourbon, but what if that slips to 90% or 85%? Then we lose not only market share in Kentucky, but in identity and image. So we're working on that as a challenge to make sure that Kentucky remains the gold standard when it comes to American whiskey. Tourism is obviously a challenge, and the biggest challenge for that is managing the growth. Really, we want to make sure that when visitors come here that they have a great time responsibly, and they're treated with our genteel Southern hospitality. Waiting for tourists right now has become something we never really imagined, but a lot of the distilleries book their tours online just because the waiting list is so long. So really, those are the two biggest things. And then I think just making sure that the quality of American whiskey remains. Here in Kentucky, our craft distillers know that they've got a legacy and 200 years of tradition to live up to. Sometimes that's not the same outside Kentucky, so we want to make sure that distillers know that we have a rich American whiskey tradition and a lot to live up to.
Well, I feel confident predicting most of our viewers probably think of Kentucky. When they think of Kentucky, they think of Kentucky Fried Chicken, Muhammad Ali. They think of the Kentucky Derby. Think of the Bluegrass State, basketball, University of Kentucky, University of Louisville, and now in the future, it sounds like they're going to be thinking of bourbon when they think of Kentucky. And I flash back years ago. There used to be a slogan. It's called coal. Back when coal was popular, which coal is not popular anymore, and it's in decline, but for many reasons. But they would say coal was Kentucky's ace in the hole. This may be now that bourbon is Kentucky's ace in the barrel. So we shall see
we hope so.
What will happen. But Eric Gregory, I want to thank you so very much
thank you.
for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Absolutely. Cheers. Thank you.
Cheers. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.